So today's topic is how do we understand the possibilities for global systemic school reform? And my work draws on several different examples of global school, or not school stuff, but the global systemic reform of other systems. So that's kind of what we're going to look at. So one of the things I want to point out is that the language I'm going to be using and the language I prefer to use in general is on the technical side, not the marketing side. So I want to make a distinction between the kind of language that you use a lot of people here are actually running either schools or some kind of educational center or have done that. And selling it to parents is persuasive marketing. It's not technically precise. And I've started and failed a business several times. I homeschooled other people's kids for about 5 years and was, embedded in having to market and persuade people to buy my services, which was interesting because I couldn't really describe what I was doing. That's why I wrote my first book. I realized, wait a minute, if I can't tell them what I'm, if the classic question is, what do you teach? And I was never satisfied with the idea of saying I teach reading or I teach a subject or anything like that because I didn't. I ran it was a self-directed learning environment. It was a consensus-run small group where we used the community as the primary learning resource. And so eventually what I settled on was I teach attitude. But by then I'd kind of gotten out of that business, so it didn't really, I wasn't able to do it fully. But that's actually what my company is called, is Attituder. And so part of what I've realized is that one, I did all my homeschooling of other people's kids before I discovered democratic schooling and a bunch of the alternatives that exist in the world. And so I thought I was doing something rather original, and it turns out it wasn't. And so that context had me like, oh, wait a minute, there's this whole community of people and they're doing this stuff, why why aren't they more of a, why haven't they had a bigger impact? Why aren't they the default rather than the opposite? Why are they so marginal to the industry? And over time, I've so in the late 90s, early 2000s is when I did my homeschooling of other people's kids, finished my degree in psychology in 2012, and have, been looking at this for a long time. And so one of the things I realized is that I don't think it has anything to do with marketing or persuasive language. I think it has to do with technical language. And so I came to that. That's why when I did my thesis research, I was studying democratic schools and trying to figure out, okay, how do we understand them in a technical sense? And what I was looking at was patterns of motivation. So I wanted to bring this up. This is actually from the introduction to the book, but we'll get to the 10th chapter in a minute because we're going to come back to this. But I wanted to make sure that you should know that what I'm talking about is technical and it doesn't displace or prevent people from doing marketing language. But the key thing that I am concerned with is political language, because competent competent political operatives are doing some blending of these things. And we'll come back to what that means later. But my focus has been on the technical side, but I do have experience in politics. Specifically, there's this organization called Portland Clean Air. I am a co-founder of Portland Clean Air, and what we do is fight air pollution, industrial air pollution in the Portland, Oregon area. And so the woman in the white top there is Jen. She was my coworker. She was someone who went out and did the canvassing like you see here. There's a bunch of people with clipboards, and they say, what Jen would say is come and say, do you have a moment to talk about air pollution? And a conversation would ensue. And within 5 minutes, she'd ask for a donation. Some people would say yes. Most people would say no. But if you were to say, do you have a moment to talk about democratic education or holistic education or name whatever alternative you're involved with, democratic learning centers or self-directed learning, no one would know what you're talking about except some of the people that we already know. Most people wouldn't know what you're talking about, and you would take you 10 minutes just to explain what you meant. Even then, they probably won't understand it. And the likelihood of getting a donation is extremely small. So because I spent 8 years in an organization that our primary thing was this kind of community organizing, we're out there getting people to donate money to our cause. I said, why is it that I can go up and have a conversation in 5 minutes and ask for money and get enough donations to make a living. Or Jen is actually really good at it. I was never, I didn't actually do the canvassing. I only made my living canvassing for about 6 months, but then as co-founder, I was the lead administrator and doing all the behind the scenes stuff. But why is it someone like Jen can go out and make a living canvassing against air pollution, but she can't do the same thing for education? And there's a different way of speaking in this political kind of conversation. This isn't just selling someone on something because they aren't actually getting something out of it. They're participating in politics, not an exchange of value for goods or services or anything like that. So it's a different kind of conversation, and I'll come back to that later. But my puzzle was, why is it we can do it as environmentalists, but I can't do it as an educator? Okay. Does anybody know what this is besides Joyce? Actually, well, I'll assume you don't. There's some Americans who probably would, but most of the people probably, if you're around the world, don't know what this is. This is a video game from the 1980s called The Oregon Trail. I live in Oregon. Joyce and I live in Oregon. And the Oregon Trail is an interesting thing because it's a 2,100 deadly miles that people in 1848 took 4 months to traverse that 2,100 deadly miles. So it literally is killed. The chances of dying on the Oregon Trail are 1 in 10. Okay. And yet hundreds of thousands of people made that journey. Now, imagine that a canvasser shows up. He magically appears and he says, "Hey, guess what? I've got this thing called an airplane. An airplane will take you from Independence, Missouri, the 2,100 miles to Oregon in one day instead of 4 months. And the chances of dying are less than are orders of magnitude. It's orders of magnitude safer. Oh, and by the way, we don't know when between now, April 1st, and October, it will come and pick you up, but you'll get there nonetheless. Now, which do people choose? Do they choose their ox-drawn wagon, walking every day, having to set up camp, break down camp, take care of their animals, run the risk of being attacked by hostile animals or hostile people, or hostile microbes? Dysentery was the one I had up there. So which choice do people make? As a psychologist, I already know the answer. The majority of people will choose their wagon. They will not choose the airplane. That's just a psychological fact because they know in 1848 what a wagon is. They have no idea. They've never seen an airplane. They don't know what it is. It's unfamiliar. It's just scary for infamiliarity. They will not choose the airplane. Now, there's a small percentage of people who will choose the airplane, and we're those people. We've already chosen the airplane. We've taken the trip. Now, the reason I said that it doesn't know when in the next 4 months it'll take you is because when you put your kid in a self-directed learning environment, you can't predict when they'll learn to read. You can't predict when they'll learn any given skill that our society generally expects them to pick up. You don't know what outcomes will be other than, and this is what we do actually have data on, they will turn out like everybody else. They will probably be slightly happier, but they will be demographically indistinguishable from everybody else. They might be slightly more entrepreneurial, but that's not a very robust finding. It's just what we find. That's based on Peter Gray's work. So this is the canvassing problem. This is our canvassing problem. We have an airplane. They have wagons. They're still using their wagons. So what I'm going to do is draw some parallels, in this case, with germ theory. Because there were times, so in the 1860s, actually about the 1860s, there was a report done by an English lord of some kind, Lord something or other, I can't remember now. But he declared that hospitals in that time were more dangerous than battlefields, and among other problems. But basically the infection rate in hospitals was 50 to 80%, and of the people who got infected, at least 50% would die. Okay, that's only a 75% survival rate if you go into a hospital. So this is what I'm going to do is talk about medicine and environmentalism, about this idea that this is a model. So moral hunch, internal coherence, external coherence, pervasive social fact. I'll talk about those in a minute. This is a model for understanding how large scale change happens. The moral hunch is in medicine in the before the 1860s is like people dying like flies. Okay, this is really bad. This is based on history from a guy named David Wooten who wrote a book called Bad Medicine. And so the moral hunch is really clear because people are dying. But it's not until the 1860s, that's why it was pre the 1860s, when Lister develops the germ theory and Pasteur actually implements it effectively. So Lister in the early 1860s, and then Pasteur's work, I think, was late 1860s. They actually had what I call, they achieved what I call internal coherence because germ theory specifies exactly what's going on. It makes good predictions about what causes disease, how to prevent disease, and you can take actions that are appropriate to that. Now, when we think about that, we would think, oh, then hospitals should have been transformed right away. They would just go, oh, of course, we were wrong, and change how they work. But of course, that's not how it works. Actually, it wasn't in the US, it was not until the next deflection point, the next change in course, was what's this thing called the Flexner Report in 1910. So decades later, finally someone says, hey, that science stuff is really catching on. It's a good thing. It really works. And Flexner was authorized by the US Congress and funded by Carnegie and supported by the American Medical Association to go around to every single medical school in the country, which there were somewhere on the order of 300 or 400, and do a little evaluation. And so he visits all of them, does this evaluation, report comes out in 1910, and he basically says, no one here is teaching, or few of these schools even have a lab, a biology lab, or a pathology lab, or whatever kind of scientific lab. A bunch of them were just sort of, do what the old guy does, apprenticeship model. And every kind of apathy you could imagine was possible. You could have your homeopathy, your osteopathy, allopathy. I forget what all the other apathies. Yeah. So any apathy you can imagine, and basically anyone who decided they were a healer could put up a sign and say, "I'm going to, have a medical school." So what the Congress did in response to the Flexner Report was they took control of medical school accreditation, as I point out there, and said, "Oh, we actually are going to require a proper lab, and we're going to require a bunch of things." And so then you might think, "Oh, okay, well, once all that gets in place, then hospitals are good to go, right?" No. David Wooten basically says it's not until the 1940s, so another few decades. Basically, once a generation had gone through those newly accredited schools, that practice really starts to change. And evidence of that is the 1940s is the first time a organ transplant happens. You cannot even conceive of transplanting an organ under in prior regimes of, if you didn't have antisepsis and asepsis practice in a hospital, you can't do an organ transplant. You can't even do surgery reliably. So that's where that comes from. But now the evidence that germ theory has truly become a pervasive social fact is that in 1977, smallpox was eradicated. In 2010, rinderpest was attacked. And they've heard of smallpox. Some of you may not know that rinderpest is a cattle disease. So it was also eradicated. So literally, those are germs, and they've been eliminated from the wild. They exist in labs, but they're no longer exist in the wild. More recent evidence of the fact that germ theory is pervasive social fact is in the pandemic. Nobody was arguing that there wasn't a germ. They were arguing what should we do about the germ that was found. And so there was, like a trivially small people who would have argued against germ theory. There's always somebody. But they were so irrelevant that even the crackpot fringes didn't give them the time of day. It was just, so the argument was, nobody argued against the germ. Everyone argued what we should do about it. Okay. So that is evidence that germ theory is now a pervasive social fact. So the reason I bring up this example is because that's what we want. We want agentic schools or democratic schools or something in education needs to become a pervasive social fact so that children are supported to learn effectively and thoroughly and such like that. Okay, environmentalism. So this is my field from before. The moral hunch was people like John Muir and a bunch of other people at the time. In the 1860s, they helped, or 1850s, anyway, at some point they founded the first national parks in the world. But then by the 1870s, they're realizing, like, wait, actually, the old way of thinking about the environment was what they call frontier economics, which was God gave us these resources. It's our job, it's our obligation to exploit them for our benefit. And so that's what leads to the deterioration of the environment. John Muir and people are arguing, no, there's something more to this. We need to do something different. And so they actually founded the Sierra Club because they realized that the political position that the national parks are in are not capable of stopping the exploitation that they're doing in the national parks. So national parks are basically just, oh, well, let's let people do the tours and things. Well, they would just come in and, they used to throw garbage into the Yellowstone geysers to watch things fly out of them. Okay, well that's terrible. And they built lodges. So they were just looking at them as commercial opportunities and just different ways of managing the resource. And what the Sierra Club is saying, no, we need to have stronger designation, stronger protection. Now the environmental movement built on that moral hunch, and I would say the evidence of internal coherence is not as strong as in germ theory, but it is things like deep ecology and when Rachel Carson's Silent Spring becomes a bestseller, and a lot of people are starting to become aware, oh, there's something going on here, and then like people understand that there is an ecological thinking is necessary in order to solve environmental problems. And then in the 1970s, we reach external coherence as evidenced by the fact that, when Nixon's established the US EPA and then other people established Earth Day and the Earth moon of the rise, that was in 1968 actually, Earth rise over the moon. But that means that people who were for environmentalism were identified, even if they may have different organizations that they're doing it with, including the Sierra Club and those things, they identified, everyone understands the movement. I could go out in 1970 and say, do you have a moment to talk about air pollution? And that's when that's a plausible thing. Now, it is not a pervasive social fact, and that's evidenced by the resistance to things like climate change and other just basic protections. And our current administration is just reeling back as much stuff as they can to try, bring back that old-timey feel of let's exploit the resources because God gave them to us. So now the question is, where's education? Clearly not a pervasive social fact. And I argue we're not even in external coherence because we don't have one of the slides I'll show you in a minute has a list of various holistic things, and then there's this thing called the Deeper Learning Canopy, which has a bunch of different kinds of alternatives in it, things like High Tech High and Iowa Big, and I forget some of the other ones. But there's all kinds of alternatives, and it's a nice spectrum from the mainstream all the way to our extreme democratic schools, but they don't even recognize each other's conferences. I've been to them all, and we can talk about them, they don't overlap. So that's evidence of a lack of external coherence, and I argue we're not even at internal coherence. So I argue, yes, we have the moral hunch, without doubt. So lots of books, lots of schools, actual organizations doing the thing that we know is different, and there are a variety of them. I go all the way back to Marietta Johnson School of Organic Education, founded in 1907. That was mentioned by John Dewey in one of his books. So it identifies as democratic, but I think Summerhill still takes the cake as far as being a true democracy, the first true democracy. They identify as democratic sort of in a broader sense. But they are an older school. And the reason I use them as my starting point is because I'm sure there are other schools that would have been just as innovative and consistent with the principles we would support, but I don't know about them because they ceased to exist, and that one still does exist today. And then we've got, so books, schools, moral hunch, no problem, we've got it. And it's a growing literature, there's just tons of stuff. And this is where I think we are now. is here's that list of, holistic schools, deeper learning canopy, Comer schools, education reimagined, what schools could be, Edutopia. So I've been trained in the education reimagined stuff. I participate in what schools could be. Edutopia, I don't pay as much. It's more mainstream and doesn't really, uh, it's not as good as it could be. But things like Comer schools, rights respecting schools, and Acton academies, and there's other kinds of micro school things that all fit within kind of the idea of where we are at. Now, rights respecting schools I'll mention here because this is the Rights Centric Education Network. Rights Respecting Schools is a program of UNICEF that is doing things that we consider, straightforward, like, hey, yeah, kids should be represented in decisions that affect them and, rights stuff. It's UNCRC kind of stuff. And so that's a program that goes into the mainstream schools and says, here, you can earn a certification if you do these things in your school, and then they earn awards to be able to do that. So really cool stuff, stuff that we would think was obvious, but whenever I've brought this up to people I did this is a section of a larger presentation I did at the Summerhill IDEC Festival of Childhood stuff, and nobody there had ever heard of rights respecting schools from UNICEF. So it was, made my point. So we lack internal coherence because we don't even recognize our allies, and we don't have, and I think what we need is internal coherence around self-determination theories. We have a scientific, we're on the path more like germ theory than we are environmentalism with kind of more vague things, but I think we have a solid foundation for that. Now I want to jump back to this idea of the languages that we use, the discourses that we use, because I want to point out that they're not mutually exclusive. So in business, they have marketing and they have technical stuff. You have to manage if you're a widget maker, you have to technically manage the making of those widgets, but you also have to sell them, and those are two different languages. And in between those is this entrepreneurship piece. And so entrepreneurship is how, sure, I may have sold a bunch yesterday, but am I going to be able to sell the same number tomorrow? Because if the market for widgets is changing, I need to maybe adjust the widget, or maybe adjust my marketing, or maybe adjust something to ensure that in the future my sales stay in a reasonable, keep my business going. That's entrepreneurship, looking at a bigger picture. And I think it's parallel in this case. And what I want to point out is that politics also has different aspects of it. Is right now in my country, we have an administration that has excelled at campaigning in the marketing language sphere, and they seem to be completely incompetent in the technical managing and administering sort of sphere. And I'm not sure that they, in the absence of that technical stuff, they're all marketing and no managing. And so that's a problem. So that's what I want to point out here, is that it's not mutually exclusive. The language I bring into this, and we'll talk next week about more of the technical language and some of the stuff in there, but it's about how do we ensure that these things, we have to have a strong technical language in order to have effective political leadership. And that is also overlaps with this whole marketing, selling, campaigning kind of stuff. Okay. So the internal coherence I propose is around self-determination theory. And that's general consensus. What we're aiming for is to generate a general consensus. Right now, self-determination theory is in the literature in education, because I have found out that that's true. However, it's not embedded in policy. And merely embedding it in policy is not going to be enough, because actually in Singapore, it already is. And we were at a conference, and there's a big contingent from Singapore, and they came and they said, hey, exciting news, Singapore is national policy says self-determination theory is the way to go. And every single one of the people who was reporting on it was saying they don't know what to do. The teachers don't know what to do with that. It's not part of how they think about what they do, and so it's very challenging nonetheless. So the embedding it in policy, that's my niche. So Deeper Learning Advocates, the nonprofit side of my organization, the mission is to embed the psychology of learning in policy so policy stops undermining learning. Nice idea. However, also that's not quite enough. Yes, that needs to happen, but in order to be truly effective, we need to generate that internal coherence so that then the political demands that would be made through those policies becomes more externally coherent. So I'm working on both simultaneously in a way. But I want to build, and what I'm suggesting for this group, and we can discuss this, is we need to not aim at a general consensus, that'll eventually come, but what we need is a specific consensus. We need to go to our natural allies and say, hey, can we agree on something? And then next week we'll talk about what that something I'm suggesting should be. But for right now, the idea is let's get to our natural allies and say, hey, I think there's some common ground here. And it may be, and going back here, it may be, I'll put this out, is that the UN rights of the child, the rights declarations and things like that, are intended to be a political document. They've been intended to enact political change. But I suggest is that part of the reason it hasn't had the traction it needs and stuff is because it lacked the proper technical discourse that to support it. So, and what I'm saying is, what I want to do is everything I'm talking about is perfectly consistent with the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. What we need to do, though, what I'm bringing in is to say we need to have this technical language to pave the way for that political language to really have the effect we need it to have. And it's going to require some marketing and campaigning and things like that, which is not my area of expertise, but it is something I recognize needs to happen. So I think there's multiple discourses that are happening and that are all necessary. So I'm focused on technical. CRC people are focused on a political thing, and everybody who's trying to run a school is on the marketing side. Okay, so next week, what I will be focused on is Back to Basics 2.0, which is Manifesto Chapter 1. It actually includes part of the appendix, first appendix too, and that's what we'll focus on is what that specific consensus be. Today, we'll just talk about, I'm about to open it up to questions and we'll go from here. What should we be thinking about in terms of the larger picture? Does it make sense to seek the specific consensus? Does it make sense to think about the bigger picture of how these systems change? So I think that's the end of my presentation.